The explosion did not sound like war. It sounded like a rule breaking. At 4:12 in the morning, a single streak of fire ripped across the Caribbean darkness, caught first by a U.S. early warning satellite, then by every analyst who understood what was at stake. For decades, nothing in those waters had ever moved without Washington noticing. No rogue missiles, no foreign guidance systems, no surprises. But this one broke every pattern because the missile did not come from Russia or China. It came from Venezuela. And the encrypted flight control signature guiding it, the digital handwriting of the launch, matched one country only: Moscow's newest coastal strike architecture. That should have been impossible. It wasn't. The moment the data confirmed the match, a quiet shock ran through the Pentagon. Someone had activated a weapons system that Caracas was never supposed to possess, much less fire. And the question troubling every commander was no longer who launched it, but how long had this alliance been forming behind closed doors? A secret pact, a hidden deployment, a geopolitical gamble bold enough to bend the balance of power inside the US hemisphere. And suddenly, without a single warning, a new military corridor seemed to be opening east to west, placing a rival power just 90 minutes from US shores. As the alert rippled through Washington, one thought echoed across the Situation Room. If another superpower armed a nation this close to American territory, what would you expect the United States to do next? The shock did not stop at the launch. It spread fast. By 5:20 in the morning, the National Military Command Center inside the Pentagon was already glowing with overlapping radar traces and satellite feeds. Dozens of analysts crowded around a single line of data that made no strategic sense. Venezuela hadn't just received Russian hardware, it had activated it. At first, senior officers tried to frame it as political theater, another attempt by Caracas to provoke attention. But then an analyst froze mid-sentence. She zoomed in on the missile's telemetry, isolating the guidance pattern buried inside the launch sequence. The room fell completely silent. The missile's flight logic, a specific timing rhythm used to adjust course during sea skimming, matched a system stationed thousands of miles away in Kaliningrad, a system built to challenge NATO fleets. Why would Moscow export something that dangerous? And why export it now? Before anyone could answer, a second radar echo appeared, then a third. These signatures were not Venezuelan. The algorithmic fingerprint revealed something unmistakable. Russian advisors, possibly operators, were active inside Venezuelan bases. That changed the crisis instantly. What had looked like a regional stunt now felt like the opening move of a long-term strategy. A slow pivot of power, one aimed directly at U.S. credibility in its own hemisphere. Tension in the command room tightened as officers pieced together the new reality. If Russia was embedded in the launch sequence, if Venezuela had access to advanced coastal strike logic, and if activation had been timed before sunrise, this wasn't a demonstration. It was a message. A message written in missile code. A colonel exhaled sharply and whispered what everyone else was thinking. If this is only the first step, what's the second? And the truth was even darker. No one in that room could answer it. By 6:40 in the morning, the first full intelligence packet reached U.S. Southern Command in Miami, and the moment it opened, the room shifted from tense to stunned. The packet didn't show a random missile launch or a symbolic gesture. It showed a structure, a pattern, a system that had not only been delivered to Venezuela, but quietly activated piece by piece. 3 coastal strike batteries positioned along the Paraguay Peninsula, placed exactly where they could threaten commercial shipping and force U.S. destroyers into predictable lane. 2 Russian radar specialists operating near Puerto Cabello, controlling uplinks that Venezuela had never possessed the training to use. And 1 encrypted command link tying all of it back to a remote node believed to be run by Russian naval intelligence, a node previously associated with operations in Crimea and the Eastern Mediterranean. This was not an accident. This was architecture. But the detail that froze the entire briefing was not on land. It was at sea. S. Thomas Hudner, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer patrolling less than 100 nautical miles north of Venezuela, the crew tracked the aircraft in complete silence. The Spy-1D radar painted a continuous arc of the fighter's movement, and although nothing it did crossed into hostile parameters, everything it did signaled intent. This was not a random flight. It was observation, probing, calibration. By 7:15 in the morning, Southern Command activated a rapid response simulation protocol to assess risk. The projections were blunt and unforgiving. One scenario showed that a full Russian-supplied salvo could target major shipping lanes in under 8 minutes. Another showed that U.S. destroyers near Curacao would have less than 200 seconds to detect, classify, and intercept incoming threats. On the digital map, the Caribbean lit up red, not with war, but with possibility. Then, at exactly 7:26, the possibility became motion. A coded transmission crackled through naval channels from a U.S. destroyer operating north of Venezuela. Unidentified airborne contact, 60 miles, speed rising. A Venezuelan Su-30 Mach 2 flying low, aggressive, and far too precisely was approaching. And according to scattered intelligence, the aircraft was likely being flown, trained, or guided by Russian instructors. The fighter dipped abruptly toward wave-top altitude, almost erasing itself from radar. That maneuver was not Venezuelan. It was Russian doctrine, straight from Black Sea playbooks used against NATO ships. Inside the destroyer's CIC, sailors worked calmly, professionally, deliberately. This was not panic, this was preparation. But every person on that ship understood the gravity of what was happening. A foreign aircraft was testing American defenses just hours after a foreign missile signature appeared inside U.S. proximity. Deliberate provocation? Dangerous miscalculation? Or was someone in Moscow adjusting the entire operation in real time? Inside the White House Situation Room, the National Security Advisor asked the question hanging over every screen: is this Venezuela acting or Russia speaking? 20 seconds later, the Su-30 Mach 2 leveled off, holding a direct vector toward international waters patrolled by an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The American captain's voice remained steady, but the choice before him was razor-thin: maintain restraint, or prepare for the first armed confrontation in the Caribbean in decades. And as the fighter closed the gap, neither in Miami nor Washington, could predict what would happen next. By 8:11 in the morning, the Venezuelan Su-30 Mach 2 was already slicing a low path across the Caribbean, flying barely above the sea spray with a precision that clearly did not come from Caracas. Every angle of its descent, every shift in its thrust, carried the unmistakable discipline of Russian training. On board the U.S. Thomas Hudner, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer patrolling less than 100 nautical miles north of Venezuela, the crew tracked the aircraft in complete silence. The SPY-1D radar painted a continuous arc of the fighter's movement, and although nothing it did crossed into hostile parameters, everything it did signaled intent. This was not a random flight. It was observation, probing, calibration. By 8:16, the fighter banked sharply into a vector Russian pilots often used when shadowing NATO ships in the Black Sea. The destroyer's captain studied the trajectory, refusing to allow theatrics to dictate U.S. behavior. "We stay steady," he said. "They do not choreograph this." Even as he spoke, satellites confirmed another presence in the theater, a Yuri Ivanov-class intelligence vessel drifting just off Venezuela's coast. The ship moved slowly, broadcasting nothing, but its purpose was unmistakable. Russia was not simply monitoring the crisis, it was recording U.S. reaction time, radar discipline, and decision logic in real time. The Su-30 Mach 2 was not acting alone. It was the visible tip of a much larger operation. Then, at 8:22, the situation escalated with surgical precision. A coastal radar, beam tight, focused, and unmistakably foreign, locked onto the Thomas Hudner for exactly 6 seconds. Not 5, not 7, 6, long enough to send a message, but short enough to avoid triggering an automatic defensive response. The waveform signature matched the Bastion P system, Russia's premier coastal defense radar used to guard Crimea. The implication was immediate and sobering. Venezuela was not only receiving Russian hardware, it was receiving Russian doctrine, settings, and engagement logic. As that realization settled, a new complication emerged. A Venezuelan patrol corvette began closing distance, slow and deliberate, offering no hail and no declared intention. The approach was measured, almost lethargic, yet the silence behind it was intentional. Someone wanted American nerves, stretched to the limit, without crossing the legal threshold of aggression. Despite the tension, the Thomas Hudner held firm. Missile defense systems remained on guarded standby. Electronic warfare teams monitored every pulse. But there was no escalation, no panic, no rush to react. Discipline remained the defining line. And then, without warning, the entire scenario dissolved in a single coordinated motion. The corvette shut down its sensors, the Su-30 Mach 2 pulled up and veered off. The coastal radar beam vanished mid-sweep. 3 separate elements, air, sea, and shore, disengaged at the same instant, as if following an unseen countdown. This was not disorder. This was choreography, a 3-phase probe, perfectly timed, designed to map U.S. response patterns exactly the way Russia has done in the Baltic and the Black Sea. For the first time in decades, Moscow appeared to be running a rehearsal inside the Western Hemisphere, using Venezuelan territory as its stage and American waters as its test environment. Inside the Pentagon, the significance hit with full weight. One analyst finally broke the silence with a question no one wanted to voice. Did Russia just reveal the first step of a new doctrine for the Western Hemisphere? By 9:03 in the morning, the Caribbean looked deceptively calm, but no one inside U.S. Southern Command felt reassured. The earlier maneuvers were no longer viewed as isolated provocations. They were now understood as elements of a structured playbook, one that mirrored Russian hybrid maritime doctrine with unsettling precision. The arrival of new intelligence at 9:17 only deepened the concern. Satellites had spotted 2 additional Russian-flagged cargo ships entering Venezuelan waters under escort, both carrying unusually dense communications arrays. Their formation mirrored the convoys Russia used to resupply Syria during the height of its intervention, which meant the purpose was not diplomatic or symbolic. It was operational. Just 11 minutes later, at 9:28, reconnaissance satellites captured something that tightened every jaw in the briefing room. A convoy of Venezuelan military trucks was towing long box-shaped launch vehicles near Puerto Cabello. Their reinforced chassis looked eerily similar to the Russian Iskander support fleet. Whether they were functional units or decoys didn't matter. What mattered was timing. Someone wanted Washington to see this movement at the exact moment Russian ships were arriving offshore. It was as if each piece was being placed into position for maximum psychological impact. And then at 9:39 came the transmission that changed the entire character of the crisis. A high-frequency encryption burst was intercepted, bouncing between Caracas and what appeared to be a Russian Northern Fleet relay node. The routing path suggested coordination, not consultation. If the signal was authentic, it meant Russian personnel weren't just advising Venezuela. They were influencing operational decision-making inside a Western Hemisphere missile network for the first time in decades. One general summarized the implication with blunt clarity. If Moscow is testing boundaries here, then they're testing the very idea of hemispheric order. At 9:51, the situation intensified again when a formation of Venezuelan drones lifted off in a coordinated grid pattern and approached from the southwest. They were unarmed, small, fast, but unmistakably configured to map radar exposure, an approach identical to the probing tactics China uses against U.S. carrier groups in the South China Sea. With that single flight path, the picture changed once more. This wasn't just Russian doctrine being adopted. It was a hybridization blending Russian positioning with Chinese sensor warfare to create a new model tailored for the Caribbean. The Thomas Hudner held course with disciplined restraint. Electronic warfare teams monitored every shift in frequency. Missile defense crews remained poised without escalating. The ship was not there to start a conflict, it was there to understand one. And understanding became far more complicated when, at 10:01 in the morning, Venezuela transmitted a maritime notice declaring a temporary military exclusion zone extending 50 nautical miles beyond its recognized waters. The line cut directly into routes frequently used by U.S. destroyers and carrier support corridors. The message was unmistakable. We are drawing new boundaries. Cross them, and we control the narrative. Washington understood the trap immediately. If the United States ignored the claim, Venezuela, and by extension Russia, would accuse the U.S. Navy of violating a declared zone. If the United States complied, it would symbolically acknowledge a new sphere of influence carved inside U.S. proximity. The hemisphere's balance was no longer being tested, it was being reshaped. And just as the debate reached a breaking point, another synchronized shock hit. A coded burst from the Yuri Ivanov-class vessel triggered simultaneous radar activations across 3 Venezuelan bases, not targeting, not tracking, just lighting up. A coordinated display of reach, capability, and confidence across hundreds of miles of coastline. The intent was painfully clear. Russia wasn't simply supporting Venezuela. It was anchoring itself inside the Western Hemisphere and signaling the beginning of something larger, a doctrine shift, a rehearsal, a message, and the question hanging over every screen inside Southern Command was no longer hypothetical. Was this a calculated masterstroke or the opening move in a long-term challenge to American influence? By 10:43 in the morning, Washington believed it had finally mapped the contours of the crisis. Russian coastal batteries quietly embedded in Venezuela, intelligence ships drifting offshore, a newly declared exclusion zone pushing aggressively into U.S. naval routes, and a pattern of coordinated probes designed to test American restraint. It was tense, calculated and familiar, an escalation that mirrored the same playbook Moscow had used in Crimea, in Syria, and in the Baltic. U.S. analysts thought they understood the threat, but 9 minutes later, the first crack appeared in that assumption. At 10:52, the passive sonar grid on the USS Thomas Hudner suddenly flickered, not with noise or interference, but with complete silence. The system went blind instantly, cleanly, as if the ocean itself had vanished. Before diagnostics could start, U.S. Cyber Command detected a faint ripple spreading across communication networks in northern Brazil and eastern Colombia. The signature was delicate, almost polite, hidden inside normal traffic patterns. But one detail made every expert freeze. The waveform matched a family of techniques perfected by a nation that specializes in silent distortions and sensor deception. It was not Russian, it was Chinese. That realization struck like a cold front sweeping through the operations floor. If Russia was visible on the surface and Venezuela was executing the choreography, then the quiet digital fog creeping across the Caribbean belonged to a third actor, one with far more experience disrupting the situational awareness of U.S. carrier strike groups in the Pacific. The crisis had never been bilateral. It had been triangular from the beginning. At 10:59, the situation deepened. The Thomas Hudner reported that its radar view of the Venezuelan coastline no longer matched overhead satellite images. The digital shoreline appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting as ghost signatures pulsed across the screen. False vessels, false aircraft, false reflections. This was the same illusionary technique used in the South China Sea, where Chinese electronic warfare units routinely generate phantom fleets to confuse adversaries and mask their real positioning. For the first time, the Caribbean felt like the Pacific. And for the first time, the United States could not fully trust what its own sensors were seeing. At 11:06, the twist solidified beyond any doubt. A short encrypted transmission, routed through a Venezuelan coastal base, carried a coordination code used exclusively during joint China-Russia naval drills in the Sea of Japan. It was a shared protocol, one reserved for exercises where both militaries operate inside the same digital architecture. The code appearing here meant only one thing. Venezuela was not receiving support. It was being integrated. Suddenly, the crisis looked nothing like a regional flare-up. It looked like a rehearsal, a controlled experiment designed to test whether the United States could maintain clarity, deterrence, and reaction discipline while facing layered pressure from two rival powers at once. Russia provided the muscle, China provided the distortion, Venezuela provided the geography. Together, they had created something far more dangerous than a missile launch, a temporary pocket of strategic uncertainty inside the U.S. hemisphere. Inside the Pentagon, one admiral captured the gravity of the moment with a single line spoken so quietly that only those nearest heard it. This isn't provocation, it's demonstration. A demonstration of coordination, a demonstration of influence, a demonstration of how quickly clarity can collapse when adversaries work together beneath the surface. And the question hanging over every screen inside Southern Command was no longer hypothetical. Was this a calculated masterstroke, or the opening move in a long-term challenge to American influence? By 10:43 in the morning, Washington believed it had finally mapped the contours of the crisis. Russian coastal batteries quietly embedded in Venezuela, intelligence ships drifting offshore, a newly declared exclusion zone pushing aggressively into U.S. Thomas Hudner still held its position with disciplined resolve, but the deeper lesson of the day had already settled across Washington. This confrontation was never about a single missile, a lone aircraft, or even Venezuela itself. It was about something far more fundamental, the testing of American perception. From the moment the first missile signature appeared at 4:12 in the morning to the moment U.S. sensors filled with ghost fleets and breathing coastlines, a single truth became impossible to ignore. Adversaries were no longer challenging the United States with force alone. They were challenging its ability to interpret the battle space, to distinguish the real from the artificial, and to adapt under layered pressure where geography, hardware, cyber intrusion, and information warfare all blend into a single arena. Russia brought the muscle coastal strike batteries, radar beams, air probes, intelligence ships. China brought the shadow sensor distortion, digital fog, phantom signatures, algorithmic misdirection. Venezuela brought the proximity, a launch point, close enough to shift the balance inside the Western Hemisphere itself. Together they created a three-sided experiment aimed not at breaking U.S. power, but at measuring it. Yet, the most revealing moment of the entire crisis was not the missile launch, the radar locks, the drone grids, or the digital deception. It was the American response. Throughout every escalation, the U.S. Navy did not flinch. It did not rush, did not panic, did not lash out. It stood its ground with the same steady composure that has anchored global stability for generations. The world saw tension rise, but it also saw something greater: the endurance of American strategic maturity. Because the nations probing the United States understand a truth that is rarely said aloud. Their power grows only when America reacts impulsively. Their influence widens only when America misreads the field. Their ambitions advance only when America loses patience or clarity. That did not happen today. And here lies the paradox of the modern world. Those who seek to challenge the United States spend enormous resources, billions in hardware, cyber units, and proxy networks because they know the military balance still favors Washington. They know American destroyers, carrier strike groups, and defense networks remain the backbone of global stability, not because they seek confrontation, but because they prevent it. Deterrence is not a threat. It is a responsibility. What unfolded in the Caribbean was not merely a test of weaponry. It was a test of resolve, one that showed how quickly perception can be manipulated and how quietly adversaries can attempt to win without firing a shot. But it also revealed that the Western Hemisphere remains anchored not by who shouts the loudest, but by who stays calm when the edges of order begin to shake. If there is one lesson from this day, it is this: military power does not exist to start wars. It exists to prevent them before they ignite. One moment of doubt can open the door to chaos. One moment of clarity can close it for an entire generation. The hemisphere trembled today, but the balance did not break. The United States stood firm, and everyone watching from allies to adversaries saw exactly what that meant. So now the question falls to you. Do you believe this quiet confrontation marks the beginning of a long-term strategy to challenge U.S. influence, or was it a one-time demonstration meant to measure American resolve? And in a world shifting toward fog, deception, and hybrid pressure, does strength still deter chaos? Or is a new era of uncertainty already unfolding?